Hi, my name is Estelle Hebert, and I'm a graduate from the Master of Fine Arts program, Documentary Media. I'll be presenting a practice-based research entitled Passing Lines, Queer Refugee Claimants, Journeys, Testimonies, and Liquid Identities, focusing on refugees who have made their refugee claim based on their sexuality. As this is a practice-based research project, I've produced and created a documentary media project, which takes the form of a sound documentary. And I'm going to go into more details about the actual creation of this documentary a little later. Also, please note that this research and documentary project focuses on Canadian refugee cases and the Canadian immigration system. Before I introduce specific points and topic questions, let me first begin by reading a quote from Zygmunt Bauman. Zygmunt Bauman says, "Uncertainty is the natural habitat of human life. Through the hope of escaping uncertainty is the engine of human life pursuits." And so when we think of refugee life, we think of uncertainty. Refugees are not sure where they're going to end up. They're not sure what the future really holds for them. They're hoping to get a more stable life, to have protection, and really that's their engine to keep going down that road of refugees. Some people are refugees for a very long time. And what's also tough for queer refugees specifically, because that is the focus of this research project, is they must also prove their sexual identity. They must also prove that it's dangerous to live in their country of origin as a gay male, as a lesbian, as a woman. And so they're relying on these international organizations to have proper documentation. And it's tough because, first of all, not only do they have to prove that they're gay when they've been living in the closet, most of them, for years, but also international communities don't always have access to good research and documentation, just because homosexuality is still very taboo and even at times illegal in certain countries. And so there's a lot of gray areas. People get accepted within the Canadian immigration system, other people's don't, and there is a refugee definition out there that was established by the United Nations back in 1951, and it seems to me that it's still under this very definition, that's how we define and should understand what a refugee is. But I think that refugee experiences, they vary, and we can't just try to solidify this notion of what a refugee is. I think we need to go beyond that to understand what refugee and the refugee life is, go beyond that definition that the United Nations established back in 1951. And so I came up with a list of 4 questions that I'll be addressing. The first question: how can an individual successfully prove his or her sexual identity to a judge or immigration officer? Most refugees live in the closet, or have lived in the closet in their country of origin, because they were too afraid to come out, because it was dangerous for them. So how do you prove that to an immigration officer or to a judge? Second, how should sexual identity be understood in the context of queer refugee claimants? We all have different notions of what sexual identity is, and so how can we understand that in this context of refugee claimants who have lived in the closet for a long period of time? Third, how should one respond to queer refugees' testimonies and stories told both inside and outside the courtroom? And fourth, how should one understand the journeys and situations of queer refugees? And again, this is key, because what I'm trying to do with this research project is to try to promote fair trials in the end. So how should an immigration officer or judge who have never been a refugee in the past, how should they understand these journeys and situations that these queer refugee claimants are in or have been in? I came up with 3 aspects that must be understood and considered both within and outside the courtroom prior to judgments. And the first thing is that queer refugee identities must be understood as liquid. And liquid is a term inspired by Bauman's work, and it's used throughout this presentation in reference to the changing state of a given being, characteristic, object state, and or in the case of refugees, identity. And so liquidity implies continuous movement, suggesting the adoption of different forms and shapes throughout one's development over time. And the term fluidity and fluid is used similarly. And so both liquidity and fluidity suggest that which is unfixed, variable, and inconsistent. What I'm talking about when I say that their identities must be understood as liquid is that they're always changing. So it's hard for them because they're pretty much against these rigid structures put forth by the immigration system. These rigid structures, such as this idea of having a specific definition to define what a refugee is, when it's just so much more than that. Secondly, their stories and testimonies must be recognized as fluid. By this I mean I can tell you one story today, I can try to tell you the exact same story tomorrow, but it'll never be exactly the same. I might remember certain things tomorrow that I don't think about today, specific moments of a story, or I might even say it a different way. My tone of voice will be different. I might have more emotion today and have less emotion tomorrow. And so we must understand that stories and testimonies must be recognized as fluid. They're never exactly the same, even if you try to retell the exact same story. And particularly in the courtroom, refugee claimants are nervous and stressed because they have one shot at it, they're questioned, and they have to think about every single word they're going to say. And we must take that into consideration as well. Third, their stories must be acknowledged through a deep listening practice, and their situation must be valued through empathy. Deep listening practice is beyond the intensity of full listening, so you can also reach into a form of listening that not only hears what is said, but also seeks to understand the whole person behind the words. So in deep listening, you listen between the lines of what is said, hearing the emotion, watching the body language, detecting needs and goals, identifying preferences and biases, perceiving beliefs and values, and so on and so forth. And so this type of listening reduces the dangers of running into existing cultural and social constructions, as discussed just earlier. In the case of queer refugees, deep listening can give access to a new understanding of the fluidity of sexual identity and human experiences, while improving mutual understanding and trust. In other words, listeners must imagine the ways by which homosexuality is understood in different cultures where people live with different beliefs, values, and experiences. Particularly in Canada, where homosexuality is viewed completely differently as it is perhaps in Ukraine and Trinidad and Nicaragua and different countries. And also, their situation must be valued through empathy, and by empathy, it's different from sympathy. I mean, sympathy assumes that everyone feels the same way in a given situation, but empathy assumes differences. You can avoid preconceptions and stereotypical ideas. Empathy is extremely hard to grasp, but I talk about it a lot in the article because I think it is extremely important for immigration officers and judges to look at refugee situations through empathy. And so I'm going to speak a little bit right now about my research methods as a documentary practitioner. I've never been a refugee myself, but the way I approach this project is I approached several organizations in Toronto. I did a lot of interviews with different refugees, and then it seemed to me that queer refugees were the ones that were most open and that were most willing to share their stories to really make this documentary for a change. So I really worked with them. It was about building a relationship and giving them the opportunity to express their stories, to express their experiences, so that I can put a documentary together that would be strong enough to put out there for the world to see. And so I focused on queer refugees after interviewing over 15 of them. So I did additional research, and that's when I came up with this conceptual framework that I explained just earlier. As a documentary practitioner, I needed a specific aim or purpose to this documentary. And Christophe Ojiko says, "The most questionable question, where are you from, should never replace, in what way can your past and present experience contribute to everyone's well-being today and tomorrow?" So that's what the idea was for me. It was not just to question these refugee claimants. I wanted them to produce some sort of effect to the audience or have an influence on the audience. And I wanted to give those refugees a voice to say, hey, there's tons of other people in a similar situation. There's tons of other people that aren't in similar situations, but they still need to hear these stories, to know what's going on with queer refugees here in Canada. And so once I had my purpose as a documentary practitioner, I decided to do a sound documentary. And I mean, there's various reasons for this. For refugee claimants, some of them are illegal in the country. Most of them don't want to be seen physically. And so I brought them into a studio and I said, you know what, this is your chance to tell your story to the world. And also with the sound documentary, I also wanted to emphasize the act of deep listening that I mentioned earlier. And then I selected 3 individuals for the final documentary project. And I won't get into their story right now, but you can always go to the website to listen to the documentary, www.passinglines.com. In listening to the documentary, I hope that you reflect on the 3 points that I made a little earlier, that refugee identities must be understood as liquid, that their stories and testimonies must be recognized as fluid, and that their stories must be acknowledged through a deep listening practice, and their situation must be valued through empathy. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for listening, and hope you all have a great day.